All right, folks. Welcome to today's deep dive into the fascinating world of Netflix's corporate culture. I'm your host, and today we're going to unpack the groundbreaking book No Rules Rules by Reed Hastings and Aaron Meyer. So grab a cup of coffee, settle in, and let's get started on this wild ride through one of the most innovative company cultures in the world. Hey there, listeners. Today we're going to spend some quality time exploring how Netflix, under the leadership of Reed Hastings, has completely revolutionized the way we think about corporate culture. Now, I know what you're thinking: corporate culture? Snooze fest? But trust me, this isn't your grandpa's corporate handbook. This is the story of how one company threw out the rulebook and still managed to become a global powerhouse. Let's start at the beginning, shall we? Picture this: it's 1997. And Reed Hastings has just co-founded a little company called Netflix. Now, Hastings wasn't your typical Silicon Valley CEO. He'd spent time in the Peace Corps in Swaziland, and he'd already founded and sold one software company. These experiences had taught him a crucial lesson: the traditional corporate playbook, it wasn't cutting it anymore. Fast forward to 2001. The dot-com bubble has burst, and Netflix is facing a crisis. They're forced to lay off a third of their workforce. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Instead of doom and gloom, something unexpected happened. Morale improved. Productivity shot up. It was like they'd accidentally stumbled upon a secret formula. This, my friends, is where the Netflix we know today was truly born. Hastings and his team had an epiphany. What if they could create a workplace filled only with high performers? What if, instead of rules and processes, they focused on hiring the best and giving them the freedom to do their best work? Now, let's break down the key elements that make up this radical approach to corporate culture. We're talking about three main pillars here: talent density, radical candor, and removing controls. Let's dive into each of these, shall we? First up, talent density. This is the bedrock of the Netflix approach. The idea is simple but revolutionary: hire the best, pay them top dollar, and be relentless about maintaining that high bar. Here's how it works in practice. Netflix pays above market rate for every position. They believe that one exceptional employee is better than two average ones, and they're not shy about letting people go if they're not meeting that high standard. They even have something called the keeper test. Managers are encouraged to regularly ask themselves, if this person were to quit, would I fight hard to keep them? If the answer is no, they're encouraged to let that person go with a generous severance package, of course. Now, I know what you're thinking. That sounds brutal. Where's the job security? Well, that's the thing. Netflix is upfront about this. They're not trying to be a family, they're trying to be a high-performing sports team. The idea is that everyone is playing to stay on the team every single day. This approach isn't for everyone, and Netflix knows that. But for those who thrive in a high-performance environment, it can be incredibly motivating. You're surrounded by top talent, you're well compensated, and you have the opportunity to do the best work of your life. Let's move on to our second pillar: radical candor. This is where things get really interesting, folks. At Netflix, giving and receiving honest feedback isn't just encouraged, it's required. We're talking brutally honest, face-to-face feedback, up and down the org chart. Now, I can almost hear you squirming in your seats. Honest feedback from anyone in the company, even to your boss. Yep, that's exactly what we're talking about. The idea is that by creating a culture of open, honest communication, you can accelerate learning and improve performance across the board. Netflix has a set of guidelines for this feedback, which they call the FORA model: aim to assist, actionable, appreciate, and accept or discard. The idea is to give feedback with the genuine intention of helping, make it specific enough that the person can act on it, appreciate the feedback you receive, and then decide whether to take it on board or not. They even have regular 360-degree feedback sessions where everyone gives feedback to everyone else. Can you imagine sitting in a room with your colleagues, including your boss, and everyone takes turns giving each other honest feedback? It sounds terrifying, right? But at Netflix, this is just business as usual. Now, let's talk about our third pillar: removing controls. This is where Netflix really starts to look different from your average company. They've systematically removed many of the traditional corporate controls that we've all come to expect. Let's start with vacation policy. Or rather, let's talk about Netflix's lack of a vacation policy. That's right, Netflix doesn't track vacation days. Employees are told to take whatever time they need, as long as their work is covered. No need to ask for approval. No need to log days in a system. Just take the time you need and get your work done. Next up, expense policies. Again, Netflix has taken a radically simple approach. Their expense policy is 5 words long: act in Netflix's best interest. That's it. No approval processes, no strict guidelines about what can be expensed. Just use your best judgment and do what's right for the company. But it doesn't stop there. Netflix has also eliminated approval processes for projects and strategies. Even junior employees are empowered to make large financial decisions if they're closest to the issue. The idea is that with the right talent density and enough context, people will make better decisions than any policy or approval process could ensure. Now, I know what you're thinking. This sounds like chaos. How does anything get done? Well, that's where the freedom and responsibility part comes in. With great freedom comes great responsibility. Netflix employees are expected to gather input from their colleagues, to think carefully about their decisions, and to take ownership of the outcomes. Let's take a moment to consider how this plays out in practice. Imagine you're a Netflix employee, and you've just had a great idea for a new feature. In a traditional company, you might need to create a detailed proposal, get sign-off from your manager, present to a committee, and wait for budget approval. At Netflix, you discuss your idea with your colleagues, gather their input, and if you believe it's the right thing to do, you just do it. This level of autonomy can be both exhilarating and terrifying. It requires a high level of trust in your own judgment, trust from the company and its employees, and trust between colleagues. But when it works, it allows for a level of speed and innovation that's hard to match in more traditional structures. Now, let's talk about how Netflix maintains this culture as it grows. Because let's face it, it's one thing to have a radical culture when you're a small startup. But it's another thing entirely to maintain it as you become a global corporation with thousands of employees. One key aspect is continuous reinforcement. Netflix doesn't just set these cultural norms and forget about them. They're constantly discussing, debating, and evolving their culture. They have regular meetings where they discuss cultural issues. They've even created a now famous culture deck that lays out their values and approach in detail. Another crucial element is leading by example. Netflix executives are expected to embody the culture in everything they do. That means taking vacation without apology, giving and receiving candid feedback, and trusting their teams to make big decisions. But perhaps the most important factor is Netflix's willingness to let people go if they're not a good fit for the culture. Remember that keeper test we talked about earlier? That's not just for show. Netflix is serious about maintaining its cultural standards, even if it means saying goodbye to talented people who aren't aligned with their way of working. Now, let's address the elephant in the room. Does this approach work for everyone? Absolutely not. And Netflix is the first to admit that. Their culture can be intense, and it's not for everyone. Some people thrive in this environment of high freedom and high responsibility. Others find it stressful and prefer more structure. And that's okay. Netflix is clear that they're not trying to be all things to all people. They're trying to create the best possible environment for a certain type of high-performing, self-motivated individual. If that's you, Netflix might be paradise. If not, it might be your worst nightmare. But regardless of whether this approach is right for you personally, there's no denying its effectiveness for Netflix. This culture has allowed them to move with incredible speed and adaptability. Remember, this is a company that started out mailing DVDs, then pioneered streaming video, and is now one of the world's largest producers of original content. That kind of transformation requires an organizational culture that can turn on a dime. Let's take a moment to consider some specific examples of how this culture has played out in practice. One famous story is about how Netflix decided to get into original content production. The story goes that Ted Sarandos, Netflix's chief content officer, was at the Sundance Film Festival. He saw a documentary that he thought was amazing, but the bidding was getting intense. He called Reed Hastings to ask how much he should bid. Now, in a traditional company, this would be exactly the kind of big, risky decision that would require CEO approval, but Hastings refused to make the decision. Instead, he told Sarandos, "If you believe this is the one, if you think it could win an Oscar, then don't let it go. Pay whatever it takes." Sarandos ended up bidding $4.6 million for the documentary, a record at the time. The film was Icarus, and it went on to win the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature. This is the Netflix way in action, trusting your people to make big decisions, even when millions of dollars are on the line. Another example is how Netflix handled its global expansion. As they moved into new markets around the world, they had to figure out how to adapt their culture to different national contexts. In some countries, the idea of giving direct feedback to your boss was completely foreign. In others, the lack of strict policies felt uncomfortable. Rather than imposing a one-size-fits-all approach, Netflix adapted. They added a fifth A to their feedback model, ADAPT. They encouraged leaders to flex their communication styles based on cultural context, while still maintaining the core principles of their culture. Now, let's talk about some of the challenges and criticisms of this approach, because make no mistake, the Netflix way is not without its detractors. One common criticism is that the culture can create a sense of insecurity. With the constant threat of the keeper test hanging over their heads, some employees report feeling stressed and afraid to make mistakes. Netflix counters this by arguing that for high performers, the opportunity to do great work alongside other high performers is worth the pressure. Another criticism is that the culture of radical candor can sometimes veer into unnecessary harshness. There have been reports of feedback sessions that felt more like personal attacks than constructive criticism. Netflix acknowledges this risk and emphasizes the importance of giving feedback with positive intent and following the 4 guidelines. There's also the question of whether this approach scales. As Netflix has grown from a small startup to a global corporation, maintaining this culture has become more challenging. Some argue that as the company gets bigger, it will inevitably need to introduce more structure and process. But so far, Netflix has managed to maintain its unique culture, even as it's grown to over 7,000 employees worldwide. They've done this through constant reinforcement, leading by example, and being willing to let go of people who don't fit the culture, even if they're high performers in other ways. Let's take a moment to consider what other companies can learn from Netflix's approach, because while the full Netflix model might not be right for every company, there are certainly elements that could be valuable in many different contexts. First, there's the focus on talent density. While not every company can afford to pay top of market for every position, the idea of prioritizing high performance and being willing to let go of adequate performers to make room for excellence is something many organizations could benefit from. The emphasis on candid feedback is another area where many companies could improve. While the Netflix level of radical candor might be too extreme for some cultures, most organizations could benefit from more open, honest communication. The idea of leading with context, not control, is also widely applicable. In today's fast-paced business environment, empowering employees to make decisions quickly can be a significant competitive advantage. And finally, the willingness to question traditional practices and experiment with new approaches is something every company should consider. The world is changing rapidly, and the old ways of doing things aren't always the best ways. Now, let's talk about the future. Where does Netflix go from here? How will this culture evolve as the company continues to grow and face new challenges? One area to watch is how Netflix handles increasing competition in the streaming space. As more and more companies enter the market, will Netflix be able to maintain its edge? Will its culture of innovation allow it to stay ahead of the pack? Another interesting question is how Netflix will adapt its culture as it moves into new areas like video games and interactive storytelling. These new ventures may require different skills and ways of working. How will Netflix maintain its cultural DNA while also evolving to meet these new challenges? And of course, there's the ongoing question of how Netflix will continue to adapt its culture to different global contexts as it expands further internationally. The challenges they face so far in adapting to different national cultures are likely just the beginning. As we wrap up, let's reflect on the bigger picture. What does the Netflix story tell us about the future of work? About how companies can organize themselves to thrive in a rapidly changing world? Reed Hastings believes that as routine tasks become increasingly automated, more and more jobs will require creativity and innovation. In this context, traditional command and control management styles will become obsolete. Companies that can build cultures of freedom and responsibility, leveraging the full creative potential of their employees, will have a significant competitive advantage. But building such a culture is not easy. It requires unwavering commitment from leadership, a willingness to make tough decisions about talent, and the courage to question deeply ingrained management practices. It also requires humility and adaptability, as what works in one context may not work in another. The Netflix culture is a bold experiment in reimagining how a large corporation can operate. It's an attempt to create a workplace that combines the creativity and agility of a startup with the resources and reach of a global corporation. Whether this experiment will stand the test of time remains to be seen. But there's no denying its impact on the business world so far. So, what's the takeaway for you, dear listener? Whether you're a business leader, an employee, or just someone interested in organizational behavior, the Netflix story offers plenty of food for thought. It challenges us to question our assumptions about what's necessary to run a successful organization. It offers a compelling alternative to traditional management practices for the modern, knowledge-based economy, and it provides a roadmap for those brave enough to try a radically different approach to building a high-performance culture. Remember, the goal isn't to copy Netflix's culture wholesale. Rather, it's to take inspiration from their willingness to question the status quo, their focus on hiring and retaining top talent, and their commitment to creating an environment where people can do their best work. As we close out this episode, I encourage you to think about your own workplace. What elements of the Netflix approach could be valuable in your context? What would it look like to increase talent density in your team? How could you foster more candid feedback? What controls could you remove to empower your colleagues? These are big questions, and there are no easy answers. But in a world of rapid change and increasing complexity, these are the kinds of questions we need to be asking. The future of work is being written right now, and whether we like it or not, Netflix is holding the pen. That's all for today, folks. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the fascinating world of Netflix's corporate culture. Until next time, keep questioning, keep innovating, and who knows, maybe you'll be the one to write the next chapter in the story of how we work.